Hello, this is Lucas, and I will talk about our work to create a translational science model for HCI. First, I will talk about the context of our study. There is a general goal in applied fields such as HCI to translate scientific knowledge to inform the work of professionals. Particularly in HCI, there is a long-standing concern among scholars that their findings do not influence practice as much as they could. In addition, Schneiderman said that there is a growing expectation from industry and governments that scientific knowledge should be made useful. However, it has been observed that few CHI papers are oriented towards supporting design practice. And this is critical because papers are one of the main dissemination materials for research findings in HCI. Past work has mentioned multiple barriers that prevent knowledge from flowing between HCI research and practice. Not only research papers are not oriented towards practice, but they are too abstract, too complicated for design practitioners to understand. Practitioners also often do not have access to research findings or don't know how to find them. Second, plenty of work has exposed that HCI researchers often do not take into account the complexities of design practice in the scientific process, which makes scientific research seem less relevant for designers. Norman and many other authors have used the research practice gap metaphor to talk about how HCI findings do not influence the world of practice. Norman argues that researchers are not concerned about the dirty and messy details entailed in commercial design. So the gap metaphor is a common way to talk about these problems between research and practice in HCI. This is a visualization of the research practice gap metaphor in HCI. There are two sides. HCI research is on one side and design practice on the other. This metaphor is a useful and simple tool to talk about this topic, but obviously it represents an extreme view of the relationships between research and practice in our field. There are many more steps and stakeholders involved in the relationships between research and practice in HCI. There are industry researchers, different types of designers, and these work in multiple environments. These stakeholders interact, communicate, collaborate in specific translations of HCI knowledge. So it is clear that the research practice gap generalizes the complex relationships between research and practice in HCI. But do we know enough about how these relationships and how translations happen in our field? How can we rethink the research practice gap metaphor to represent HCI's unique process of knowledge progression? Before I move on, just wanted to define some important terms. Translational research is the translation of knowledge through both theory-producing steps as well as design and dissemination steps. And then investigating this complex phenomena has evolved into a field known as translational science. In other words, translational science is the study of translational research efforts. So we investigated past research and interviewed multiple HCI community members to know more about their views on the research practice gap and different translations or disseminations that they participate in. And this resulted in a model of how translations occur in HCI. Now I'm going to discuss key findings from the literature review in our interviews that influenced the creation of the model. The research practice gap metaphor reflects a classic view of translational research and dissemination of knowledge. Everett Rogers published a book in '62 called The Diffusion of Innovations. In the book, he proposed a center-to-periphery model where knowledge originates from a legitimizing source and it's then disseminated to research users. This model was very influential for a long time in many fields, such as communication, marketing, etc. And then it's important to highlight some criticisms to this model. The main ones are that many groups are involved in the dissemination and translation of knowledge, not only a researcher and a professional. Second, these many groups don't just adopt or reject innovations or research findings. They are active in the process. They may translate or disseminate knowledge in their own terms. They also have valuable knowledge that is also disseminated and translated across the field, often influencing the work of researchers. I also found that there is a visible move away from models intending to persuade practitioners to use scientific output. experts in the field of translational medicine and education highlight the need for bidirectional approaches where practitioners are not seen as knowledge receptacles, emphasizing instead the interplay between academia and practice at every stage of translational research. Similarly, instead of using the research practice gap, a few HCI researchers have proposed the concept of a continuum between research and practice. Within medicine, the concept of a continuum has been detailed using what is known as the T terminology, or the translation terminology. T1 is, in translational medicine, translates knowledge from basic research to clinical research. T2 translates findings from clinical studies or clinical trials to practice settings. And T3 is about implementing scientific knowledge, so applying and evaluating interventions in real-world settings through disciplines such as communication theory, behavioral science, public policy, and design. Okay, in the interviews, most participants used the research practice gap metaphor at the start of our conversations, but upon further reflection, they noted issues with the metaphor. In the interviews, participants mentioned doing multiple kinds of translations and disseminations. HCI researchers, for example, mentioned translating research findings for media outreach, product development, education, policy making, and trying to fit these multiple kinds of translations into the gap metaphor helps to illustrate its limitations. So what about HCI research translating social psych theory? What about a researcher who graduates with her PhD and goes to industry, carrying knowledge, who uses research papers to inform product decisions at her company? What about designers who work as lecturers, incorporating their industry practices in teaching user research or design methods to students, or contributing to research in their academic departments? How are these instances represented in the research practice gap metaphor? Now I just want to ground this discussion in existing projects. For example, Consalvo and her colleagues in 2008 translated goal setting and self-monitoring into a research prototype called UbiFit. UbiFit showed users a flower garden that bloomed throughout the week as they performed physical activities. And although the connection is not clear, the same idea later showed up on the Fitbit device. Fitbit used a flower metaphor in their tracker devices with the same goal setting mechanism. Apple's designers implemented goal setting differently. The Apple Watch represents different activity targets with a ring, which fails to show progress towards goals. And as you can see on the right, the ring's design recently influenced Gouvea's research paper, research prototype that was published in UbiComp last year. This is a nice example then of how specific translations are not accounted for in the research practice gap metaphor. What are the translations that occur between basic research and applied research? And how have industry designs influenced HCI research? Okay, we then propose a model with a more nuanced view of the translational mechanisms and barriers currently at play in HCI. First, we divided basic research and applied research. After teasing out these two steps, more than one gap is also surfaced, which opens up interesting questions. For example, language is less of a problem in the gap between basic and applied researchers. Although sometimes it might be hard to locate the right work from or to understand another research tradition, it is not a deal breaker. Also, is language really the biggest barrier between applied research and design practice? Is it common for designers to read academic papers? Therefore, with such a model, we can ask more specific questions and position translational barriers more precisely. And of note, we do not assume directionality between steps here. Okay, now let's look at the steps of our model in more detail. Basic research results in general knowledge to answer a large number of problems related to people, technology, and design. This can be ethnographies of how people use or are impacted by technologies, or work on the technological boundaries like lab studies of new interaction paradigms. And this is also where research from other fields such as anthropology or psychology comes into the HCI field. Second, the applied research step is achieved by HCI researchers answering to specific problems related to how people relate to or use designs. There's also the observation of tensions and breakdowns of how people use technologies, safety issues, design ethics, of specific products or services. And here, researchers may also propose prototypes and test them. And finally, design practice, where designers or design practitioners create things in the made world. There is a consideration of specific users, all stakeholders involved in product development and commercialization. And here, just to clear things out, I had a majority of participants from interaction design, UX design, and UX research. Then, just to wrap up this slide, one participant specifically mentioned that HCI is so important because it sits in between basic research and design practice to do the translation, according to them. Now let's look at the translations between steps more closely. Applied research to design practice first. This is what is often called the research practice gap. It involves translating knowledge into resources that are actionable to design practitioners. The actionability barrier is the most salient here. A practitioner even mentioned going to the Kai-Play conference, but very little of what he saw there was applicable, and that's the only contact he has with academia. While some researchers mentioned that the research process doesn't generate resources that can be used in practice, which in their view is a major problem in HCI, some of them had success with what they called a make it happen approach. First, working as consultants in industry, learning what practitioners care about before offering recommendations. And second, creating actionable, easy to use resources. One participant explained how the idea to create a design method started. She said, this industry guy asked for resources. And then I asked myself, what do I give to this guy? She then translated findings from her published studies into a design method, which she said was a study in its own. So this is clearly an instance of translational research here. Then we found this interesting gap between basic research and applied research. The barriers here are skill set for basic researchers to do applied research and also information overload. Basic researchers noted that translating their findings into prototypes for conducting applied research is complicated and often depends on partnerships because they don't know how to build things. For example, a psychologist mentioned hiring a computer science student who was a really good app developer, and they worked together to prototype an app. But basic researchers emphasized that these collaborations tend to be temporary. The student that I just mentioned soon graduated and left the code behind, which the researchers didn't know how to manipulate. This event put their project on hold for a year, and a few basic researchers in my study even mentioned that they started learning design and engineering skills to do applied research on their own. HCI academics on their side mentioned not being incentivized to participate in communities of interest that are peripheral to HCI. They said that most of the knowledge circulation in HCI happens within the Kai community and other ACM conferences. And second, HCI academics also said their work rarely feeds back into basic research, mentioning that they are not cited in the fields of studies that they draw from, raising this as evidence for a basic applied research gap. Finally, researchers mentioned that it is impossible to keep up with developments from all fields. Okay, TBD, basic research and design. Participants initially marked this as a rare translational path, as basic researchers do not plan studies or write papers to inform practice. This is where the language and access barriers are more salient. But in my interviews, I noticed that basic research can influence design practice in different ways. For example, books written by practitioners and scholars or only scholars, sharing theory in a lighter way or blended with industry case studies. Second, outreach efforts, such as participating in radio talks, discussions in events with professionals like seminars or things like that. And finally, an interesting path here is that the training in basic research affords the abilities to work with practitioners. Okay, final gap. Interestingly, we noted a gap within HCI research. First, some participants boasted that it is very common to cross-pollinate work with their colleagues in HCI, but others mentioned that even within sub-communities, research papers often do not get cited. A participant said, I speak directly to those issues. We use the same keywords, publish in the same venues. It becomes a personal grudge, which is a problem within HCI. You may not like my work, but it should be cited. If you disagree with my approach or findings, cite it and explain why. The barriers cited for this gap were information overload and academic traditions. Participants mentioned that it is difficult to keep up with all publications within an area of studies, which is curious as most of the knowledge circulation happens within a few well-known venues. And some researchers also said that ethnographies or systems design can be devalued by some of their colleagues who do not engage with specific academic traditions or research methods. And then there's this feedback loop of knowledge coming from practice into research. Gray called it bubble up. Here I found mostly researcher-led strategies to draw on practitioner knowledge, mostly out of personal interest of people who want to know more about design trends to inform their research and to improve teaching. To do this, researchers might organize or attend practitioner conferences, follow past students in leading industry positions, and they might use online design groups. One of my participants said that it is crucial for researchers to really engage with practitioners and know how things are done in industry. This is or should be the minimum requirement to contribute to design, if your goal is to do work to inform design practice, of course. Design practitioners on their side mentioned not engaging with Bubble Up, mostly because of intellectual property restrictions. In turn, disseminating case studies on Medium has become common, and participants mentioned an interest in doing so for personal branding. Okay, now I will talk about some of the important takeaways from this study. In this work, we were able to describe multiple relationships between research and practice in HCI, as well as multiple gaps, providing a more nuanced view of the space. This understanding was presented in the form of a model that expands the gap metaphor. We think that exploring other metaphors and models, or changing the model that we proposed, is an important research thread that the HCI community should continue to work on. Okay, the interesting takeaway here is that such a model allows us to investigate and tackle translational research barriers more precisely. The model highlights, for example, that applicability is the most significant barrier for HCI research to inform design practice. So the HCI community might focus on translations that take into account the design context and make it easier for practitioners to apply relevant scientific research findings. Second, we can ask questions such as, where is research stalled or progressing well? This can help funding agencies and universities to support steps where more resources are needed. The model also helps to think about how to engage with various translators. I already talked about engaging with design practitioners, but what about science communicators or educators? Each of these come with their own challenges. For science communication, balancing scientific precision with writing content that appeals to specific audiences is very difficult. How do we leverage Reddit, Dribble, or Medium to share knowledge, share HCI knowledge, as well as to learn from practitioners? And HCI professors in the study mentioned that incorporating theory into their classes is often difficult. One of them mentioned, how do we effectively train people to be sensitive and make them think about these questions while referring to information privacy and persuasive design when they go into the workforce? To finalize, this work points to new ways of seeing translations happening or not happening across the HCI field, and we hope this can encourage more studies in this space and perhaps establish a translational science for HCI. Finally, I thank my collaborators, Ridley Jones, Munson, and Hsieh for their help with this work, and thank you for your attention.